Hello, everyone, and welcome to this program. With me on the Mubadala stage are Noor Swede, partner for Global Ventures. Welcome, Noor. And Peter Abu Hashem, head of strategy and product for Hub 71. Noor, why don't you tell us a little bit about Global Ventures and how you got involved?
Sure, thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, everyone. So Global Ventures is a venture capital firm. We're based here in the UAE. We invest across the Middle East and Africa. We invest in Series A companies, really building any technology where you're using, cutting-edge global tech to solve problems that impact hundreds of millions of lives across this part of the world and even beyond. And our thinking about that across sectors and climate, not climate, is that ultimately we are sector agnostic. We invest in any technology that is really being used for a huge market. And inadvertently, about 70% of that ends up qualifying as climate. So we're a big climate investor. However, we have a mandate to be just a venture capital investor.
And that's fascinating, and it does kind of set the context for the rise of and the ubiquity of these technologies. I mean, we heard the same thing with other statistics where it really does blur the line.
Absolutely. I think what we see here is if you're solving for mobility, especially, for example, one of our companies in Nigeria solves for mobility, but it really needs to assess energy as an input because it's expensive or completely just inaccessible. If you're solving for agri-tech, again, your energy and water input needs to be very thoughtful in terms of how much of that can you afford to make agri-tech and food actually affordable from this source. So really thinking through your energy input or your climate footprint from the beginning is just better business and enables your company to be more scalable. We've now invested in 60 companies across the region, and we've had 5 exits and we've been very lucky. But at the same time, there's always this concept from when we started of let's measure the impact, let's measure the climate, let's measure the financial inclusion that these companies are able to have, the impact on the hundreds of millions of lives, or 1.5 billion in this part of the world.
Wow, I mean, it's fascinating, the scope and scale of that and the ability for these technologies to migrate into both other spheres of influence and other parts of the world. And, Peter, your organization is kind of structured to think about the idea of an ecosystem. So tell me a little bit about Hub 71 and what the intent is.
So as an organization, as Hub 71, we've been created almost 4 years ago by the Abu Dhabi government. There's one single purpose, one single mandate: how to build a global tech ecosystem out of Abu Dhabi. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the word ecosystem, and that's a very important word in our perspective. 4 years ago, when this initiative was launched, there was close to no ecosystem in Abu Dhabi. There was not a strong tech ecosystem happening. So what we said, and we went to the drawing board and said, how do you build an ecosystem? At the center of that ecosystem is always the startups. So you bring in these young companies, the young entrepreneurs that are building new technologies, disrupting industries, and help them. What we did in the first stage was give them a set of incentives to come into a new region. Mm-hmm. We have startups from more than 25 different countries. They're relocating to Abu Dhabi. So how do we help them reduce the OPEX and give them incentives? So that was the first step. Yeah. And then over the years, what we started doing, and I think that's the unique selling point of Hub 71, was build an ecosystem around them, which we look at across 4 key pillars. How do I give them market access to their customers, corporations, government entities? How do I give them capital access? Because these companies need capital to grow and scale, and that's how we work closely with VC partners, family offices, etc. Mm-hmm. Talent, how do we give them access to local talent as well as upskill the talent that they bring into the country? And finally, regulations. How do you support them with the right regulations? And how do you support the regulators as well, leverage these startups to create new regulations? So that's what we define as ecosystem.
It's fascinating because that's a constant evolution. So as you bring new players in, it influences the whole. And I love the idea of how you approach investment. That you're looking in one particular area, but you're open to the idea that these are scalable to different parts of the world. So what's the criteria that you use for investing?
So when we think about investing in startups, or we say in founders, for us it's important that these are globally scalable or regional white spaces. So they can be both. I'll give a great example. We just invested in a company that is a software for additive manufacturing. So what they do, for example, is they work with the large oil and gas or industrial companies, and they come in and say, you guys have $1 billion or $500 million sitting in spare parts in your warehouse that you every year have to throw away 30% of because they have a 3-year shelf life. What if we created a 3D blueprint for each of these spare parts and put it in a digital warehouse and charged you a monthly SaaS fee? And then if you needed anything, we could print it locally using 3D printing or additive manufacturing. So they're in the $17 million top line, $3 million EBITDA, Dubai concept, local company, really, really changing things in the way that oil and gas and industrial companies work in this part of the world. It's a complete white space. Why? Because we still import 80 or 85% of everything. If we're going to start manufacturing and thinking about supply chain disruption, we're going to do it using the best-in-class technology worldwide. So it's a regional white space. Perfect. However, no one's doing this in Europe. No one's doing this in the US. Why? Because it would be an incremental solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. It's just a working capital problem for these companies, and they've never really thought about it. Why would they take the innovation risk? But now that you've proven it in this part of the world, you own the system, you can export these solutions. We've done this now with about a dozen companies in our portfolio where they are leapfrogging. The region is saying, how do we do this better? Because it's not like we're trying to replace incumbents or legacy. We are simply using what is the best in the world technology, what is the problem we're trying to solve. We don't have to think outside the box. There's no box. So let's just get to it. And then that becomes exportable. So about a dozen software companies in our portfolio have managed to do this and really enter worldwide markets with better technology than is anywhere in the world from the region. That's what gets us really excited. So those are the things we look for, is that excitability, the white space, the global expansion, but first and foremost, the founder, and then the founder.
But your disruptive lens is so interesting. So the perspective, right, of there's a hidden white space. And part of what I think is interesting is during the pandemic, you notice the collapse of a lot of the global supply chains. So you're looking for a way to have on demand. You're looking for a way to localize that. And here you come saying there's an ability and a technology not just to do it, but actually customize it for each of the regions and how they approach their inventory. And so if you're looking at driving that down or making that more manageable, you've given them the ability to customize by country, culture, and condition.
Absolutely. And that's one small example. Needless to say, it's ClimateTech. That's all an afterthought as far as we're concerned. And, when we take a look then at agritech, so this is supply chain tech to your point, we take a look at agritech. One of our companies based in the region again, it reduces energy consumption for vertical farming by 95%. The IP is theirs. It's the way they desalinate water. They studied the cactus plant. So, the answer is always given to us by God or the universe. And you take a look and you say, wait, they've actually studied this. They've built an IP, and now they're desalinating water with 95% energy efficiency. And therefore, vertical farming is suddenly much more commercial, much more profitable. Those foods are really addressing the food security challenge. That's a local regional company. They are now retrofitting farms in Arizona and in 7 other countries globally. So you take a look again, it's a local regional technology that is leapfrogging to solve a regional problem that is dire, but a global problem that also exists.
That's fascinating. And Peter, you talked about this idea of an ecosystem. And I think it's interesting because you think about application migration. So you might have a technology that then can be applied in a different way. There's they were thinking about how to rewire or redo the subway systems in Japan, and they used a fungus that naturally routes itself most efficiently. So they gave it the map and said, how do you get the trains here? And the fungus actually showed them better ways to do that. It's fascinating when you think about what an ecosystem can do. So what has surprised you as you've built this ecosystem? What kind of unintended consequences or advantages have come up?
So I like the word surprise because as we've been building the ecosystem, we've been wearing a startup hat ourselves. I think it's the first time I've personally worked in a government entity that operates as a startup. We've been building our MVP. We've been modifying that MVP the first few years until we reached what we call product market fit from our perspective as an ecosystem. I think the uniqueness of, in general, building an ecosystem means there's the right stakeholders around the startups, because an ecosystem, for me, the startups always at the center of it, the right stakeholders around these startups. The uniqueness of that ecosystem in Abu Dhabi is 2 things. One, the ecosystem is too close. Anywhere in the world, when you, as a company, as an early stage company, go to the US or go to Singapore or Europe to expand your business, it will take you a few months to get to know all the VCs, the right policy makers,
Yeah.
the mubadalas of the world, the incubators, the acceleration. You can do this in one day in Abu Dhabi. And just last week in Abu Dhabi Finance Week, we had people coming to us and saying, we planned a few weeks in Abu Dhabi, and within a few hours on the same island, within the same few buildings, we met everyone we need. So I think the first step is this closeness of the ecosystem where everyone's working together creates Abu Dhabi and the UAE in general as a safe playground to test out new technologies. You touched upon this in the first example you gave in your investments. The UAE is becoming this safe playground across multiple sectors, not just on climate tech and sustainability in general, where you can come in and prove your model very quickly within a few weeks or months compared to months and years in other regions, and then scale globally. You mentioned the word export as well previously in the case. When I first started, I said we're building a global tech ecosystem out of Abu Dhabi. We're not convincing startups to come for the UAE market. It's a 10 million population. It's a small population. It doesn't make sense to relocate from the US to Abu Dhabi for the market. But you relocate because you could prove the model. You could prove that, yes, it works. Yes, I can disrupt in a very short period of time because everyone's literally under one roof. That's the first element. The surprising element, which when on paper you're designing what a tech ecosystem looks like, you forget about, is the human element. On paper, you forget the human element of thing. Everything is structured. But then when you put 260 startups, 260 founders that relocated their kids, relocated their families into Abu Dhabi, you see a lot of this organic engagement happening between them. Very simple stuff of which bank account should I open? Who do I speak to in this ministry? What VCs actually serious about climate tech versus what VCs just wasting my time listening to my pitch and not investing. These informal tips shared between the community, and that's the community side of the ecosystem that we've built, are so strong because it's like-minded people that are trying to change the world together that are sharing these informal tips.
Yeah.
Couple it with that safe playground, all the stakeholders you need. And the final point is the uniqueness of the UAE from a macroeconomic perspective. You're friendly with all regions. You're central. You could access the West. You could access the East. You can access Africa. I think all of this combined is what created the secret sauce of Hub 71 and Abu Dhabi in general.
And it's interesting when you think about that. One of the phrases that I like to use is that, it's big enough to matter, but small enough to care. So you have that opportunity to really have that high touch, and then the ability to iterate very quickly. So that's something that I want to talk about with you. As you manage these funds, essentially you become the expert's expert. So they're the expert in a technology, but you're also looking at ways to help, embed them in a thriving ecosystem. So how do you approach that side of it, not just for an individual investment, but then kind of the full portfolio that you're looking at?
Well, the first thing we do is we partner with Hub 71. So we were one of the first VCs out there, and it was 6 years ago almost when we all got started together. So it's a wonderful ecosystem that they're building. I think internally we stop and think about strategic capital. So I didn't wake up one day and say I want to be a venture capitalist. My career before that was much more on the operating side, and building companies, exiting companies. And so when I decided to really start angel investing and working with founders, it was very much with the intention of the region here is massively underfunded in venture capital, or at least was 6 years ago, and we can debate whether it still is or not. Right? I still think it is. But if we could build a firm that could be a strategic capital partner for founders across their journey, and as they grow into their visions and achieve kind of their goals in life or the company's mission, what would that look like? And so that's how we started the firm 6 years ago. And so for us, it was really, you come in and wonderful, there's this pot of capital, and now what? Right? And so now is when the job starts. The job is not to invest. The job is to help the founders grow their companies, thereby creating, financial returns for our investors and impact for the world and the climate and all of it. But the goal is to help the founders achieve their missions. And so that created for us a 7-layer value creation framework where we start with processes and then it becomes ambitions and recruiting and all of the things that Hub 71 also works with to take these founders from a local best in class to more of a global best in class and enable them to compete globally and to achieve their missions and goals. I mean, so far, I'll tell you, we manage over $300 million. We're working our way shortly to $400 million, which means that that's all capital that's been put in founders' hands in this ecosystem. We've been able with Fund 1, which is a 2018 vintage, to already return over 70% of that capital. So our first fund sits at a 0.7 DPI, which for those investors in this space is a top decile fund on a financial level globally. And we haven't sold our winners yet, I always have to point out. So you take a look, and our second fund is in the top quartile financial performance globally. And you're still investing in a market which is underserved. So when we take a step back and we say, what have the founders achieved? Right? What has this portfolio actually done besides wonderful financial returns for very happy investors? Right? When we take a look at it, they've financially included 62 million people through the fintechs. They have given access to healthcare to 5.8 million people that do not have access to healthcare because the region has 0.2 doctors per thousand in Sub-Sahara and 1 doctor per thousand in MENA, compared to 4.5 in OECD. We'll never have enough doctors or hospitals. So how do we use health tech? Right? So you start taking a look. We've given access to tertiary education to over 1 million people that didn't have it before. The founders have created 11,300 jobs in a part of the world with 40% youth unemployment. So you start to measure these things. Oh, and by the way, 26% female founders in C-suites. Very important. So you start to take a look at these things and you say, they are able to achieve all of these while creating incredible top decile financial returns and sending money back to LPs. Our last exit last month was a 99% IRR, 7.2 times our money in 3 years. It's wonderful, on top of all of these other metrics that really matter. And so we're here to come in and say, as a strategic value add partner to these founders, our job is to help them achieve their goals. In that journey, we will hopefully make money, and they will hopefully impact the world and these hundreds of millions of lives, and we will prove ultimately that financial returns and social impact or climate are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, when you work well together with a value creation framework, they go hand in hand.
And what's really interesting about that is the compressed time frame. So you have this sense of urgency that's baked into a market. And then you've got a population that certainly needs more investment. So I think about it in terms of the investment as sustainable, profitable growth. And so you need all three to thrive. And I think you're setting a context here where you're able to accelerate that ability to deliver. And you can talk about the human impact. So I want to go back to usually government agencies, they're the type of things that's, they schedule time for spontaneity, right? So they've got all these processes and layers in it. And you've managed to remove that and make it a much more dynamic environment. So why? I mean, and then when you think about the way that you do that impact, how do you reach out even further and pull more people in?
So I'm going to have a lot of answers to your questions.
That's
I'm
good.
trying to put them in one story. Step one, why is the government behaving like a startup? Why is the government disrupting what they do? The answer is impact. 4 years, 260 startups, fundraised more than $1.5 billion, revenues close to $1 billion in revenue, more than 1,000 jobs created. That's the outcome of the work that has been done over the past 4 years by simply going out of the box and saying, let's operate as a startup for the sake of the startups. That's the first step. The second step is there's a lot of de-risking if you follow the journey from before the startup even hears about us until they get into Hub 71 and scale from Hub 71. We rely heavily on startups that come through our VC partners. So we have more than 35 VC partners, a few angel groups, 45 family offices that invest in companies and send us the creme de la creme and say, these companies are good, we invested in them, accept them in your program. That's the first element. The second element is, as we get these companies in, so just look at the last quarter and cohort that we had 1,700 applications compared to 100, 200 per quarter when we first started off. of startups from more than 40 countries that want to relocate and come to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
So 1,700, we're a team of almost 20, 25, we're a very small team. We don't know. We don't know if these are good companies or not. We can tell, but we need to rely on partners and experts in the field. So we had 90 partners involved in selecting from the 1,700 around 20, 25 companies to join us. So we rely on the experts across the stages of selection. The policymakers are with us. So if it's a company that's heavily regulated, the regulator is sitting with us and saying, yes, I can work with them or not before we even get them into the country. The customer, which is the corporate partner or the government entity as well, because they will end up procuring from them. If it's a B2B startup, also tell us, yes, it makes sense, or no, we don't need this technology.
Wow.
Then the VC partners as well are going and saying, okay, based on the financial metrics, I would put my money or not. So we're doing this full journey of de-risking the startup before they even land in Abu Dhabi. They're still in Singapore, they're still in the US. Before they land, everyone that will work with them, that ecosystem that we described at the beginning, feels that they have a say, that they brought the startup into Abu Dhabi. Then you go into the acceleration, your typical, let's get your product market fit ready, let's get you ready to fundraise, and the incentives, of course, which we always forget, but it's a big part, it's a big financial aspect. And then at the end of it, we bring back the full stakeholders that were involved and say, okay, as a regulator now, we need your help to regulate them. As a customer, you need to procure their service, and as a fund, we need you to now invest in these companies. I think that's the secret again behind it.
Yeah, but that's it, both of you. It's predicated on credibility over time, building trust, and so that idea of building trust. When you look at the impacts, and there were two things that you said that I thought were fascinating. One is that you're pulling more young people into this environment. So age doesn't confer wisdom here. There's a flexibility and a resilience to the launch and learn process of this. And when you add women at each level of authority, you're actually improving the outcomes. So countries that had that type of exposure responded more quickly. So what are you doing to look at that gender balance and pulling in youth in that context, nor as you think more long term, because these impacts are starting to snowball?
So I think we're very blessed in this part of the world. You have 60% of your population's under the age of 30 or 32. It doesn't really matter how you divide it. So you don't have to look far to find the youth, right? I also think that by default of having such a young population and having such a high education for women and men, you don't have to look far to find the woman.
Yep.
So for us, it's really about how do you ensure that the top of that funnel is gender balanced. We don't want to have special, carve-outs for female founders and so on, but how do you make sure the top of that funnel has enough gender balance, that we have enough outreach, that women are building companies that are beyond the typical female domains and more really cracking big problems. And some of the companies we have in that space, the role model founders are amazing. So one of them is, for example, called Proximi. A female surgeon started, sharing with her surgeon friends notes and streaming to be able to do more with less in emerging markets. It was taking them too long to get from point A to point B than to actually conduct a surgery. What she has built now is a software that has been implemented in over 400 hospitals between the UK and the US that did 19,000 virtually assisted surgeries in the US alone last year.
Wow.
Now, this was a company based out of the region, a Lebanese founder. And why here? Because, again, the regulator was happy to work with. We will never have enough doctors. So prove it here and then scale it globally. That's a female surgeon. And the other female, we just invested recently and now scaling really, really quickly, a female founder who built an HR software called Elevatas, which we as a firm have now started using as opposed to the best-in-class global software because it's really that much better, right? And so we started taking a look, and they're scaling into Europe now. So you have plenty of female founders in the region. It's about ensuring that they are enabled and ensuring that they're coming in at the top of that funnel. And as for the youth, it's almost all youth.
Yeah.
I think that we really have the opposite challenge where we want to motivate the youth, but we first want them to go and build a skill set, right? So that by the time they're starting their company, they have some work experience rather than all of them just jumping straight into entrepreneurship out of college with very little skill set or expertise.
That's what's fascinating about this. The diversity is the competitive advantage. So if you set that context, I want you, as we wind down the program, to flash forward 10 years. and think about the cumulative impact. So what you're doing is kind of training the trainers. As these entrepreneurs grow and you pull other people in, you actually have mentors. You have people who've been through this. And so they get to come back and they get to look at the scope and scale of it and add to it. And you know, so many investors, they may sell a company, they may move on to something else. You know, they might evolve. So one of the things I want you to think about when you flash forward is everybody talks about this revolution that's going to happen, but it's really 1,000 tiny turns that turn that big wheel. It's an evolution revolution. So give me a sense of what you expect, you know, Peter, 10 years from now.
We have big expectations, for sure. The leadership of Abu Dhabi has big expectations from us. I can tell you because I had a sneak peek of what our KPIs for the next 10 years are. And it's minimum 10x plus for all the metrics that we put in place. I think exactly what you said. It started off as a chicken and egg situation. When you build the tech ecosystem from scratch, you need good companies, good startups to be able to have the ecosystem go into the world of startups, to move a giant in oil and gas or in banking and retail and say, I'm actually going to procure from young startups, 25-year-old founders who have no revenue whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it kind of is this chicken and egg situation. We're beyond that stage. It's still a spiral
Sure,
in a way. But you said that the founders will become angel investors. The founders will become VCs. It will follow the Silicon Valley model in a way where it keeps spiraling, and the outcome will be 10x, 100x, hopefully.
Sure.
We don't know how it would look like.
Yeah, but what's interesting about that is in this region, you get to break rules. You don't have to do it the way Silicon Valley did it. You don't have to make the same mistakes that they did. You might come up with an entirely different way of doing it. So that's what I want to hear. You actually have a very interesting point of view because you're not really that beholden to the way that things were done before. So give me a sense of what the future looks like.
I think if we take a look at the ecosystem itself as a leapfrogging ecosystem. So we talked about how with fintech, for example, we didn't take the region from 60% unbanked to 48% unbanked in the last 5 years by building banks, right? We did that with fintech. We're not going to have healthcare access by building hospitals. We're going to do that with health tech and so on. We're not going to have manufacturing the style of the 90s. We're going to do additive and 3D. And we're not going to have, agriculture built out the same way that it got built out in other ecosystems. We're going to have to create our own way. And similarly, when it comes to our venture ecosystem and our entrepreneurship ecosystem, we're not going to do it the same way. We're going to take the learnings and we're going to say, well, that was a wonderful idea and those 3 things didn't work. And that was a great idea. And we want to emulate that and localize that for us. But what we have in the region that really nobody else has had in the world is such a friendly regulator. And I don't say that because Peter's sitting here, right? I say that genuinely. It's a regulator that has said, or regulators that have said, we want to work with startups, right? We have a minister of AI. Who has a minister of AI? And we've had that minister of AI since 2017, saying how can we use AI in every single thing that the government and the economy and this country does to make it that much better, faster, and more sensible in some ways. And so when you have a regulator that's coming and saying, how do we work with you? And then you really don't have that many incumbents or legacy or lobbies. You are able to, as the startup or as the founder, say, this is what I want to dream. Let me tell you why it works for the country. And now let me build it because there aren't lobbies and incumbents standing in my way.
Yeah.
Maybe to comment on the friendly regulator, because that's something we always go to the world and say, they're progressive regulators in a way. They're friendly until they're not. They're progressive because they want to disrupt what they're doing, but they will never allow the regulations not to be protective of whatever their mandate is. We've seen this in digital assets as well. Abu Dhabi is a very friendly regulator with ADGM. A lot of the Web3 companies are coming in, but you will not see scams coming out of it because it's a progressive regulator that has the doors open, but will not regulate everyone. And that's the theory behind it. Everyone as well that comes to Abu Dhabi, that comes to the UAE and asks, what's the catch? Why is the government entities, the corporates, everyone behind me trying to support me? What's the catch there? What are you getting out of it? And I think that's the beauty of it in the country. The vision is one. Everyone's working towards the same direction. And when everyone's going in the same direction, the whole ecosystem will move in the same direction.
Well, I mean, so the thing that fascinates me maybe is kind of the summary of the last kind of element of this is that when you really see thriving organizations, they tell you what the problem is, and then they don't tell you how to do it. They let you figure out how to do it. They give you the autonomy to do that. And I love that idea of, we give you the freedom, but we have the responsibility for the entire population. And so, what I'd like you to do is when people walk away from this, what's kind of the one message that you want them to think about this ecosystem? So I'm going to start with you, Nora.
Well, I mean, I'll end with numbers, right? So last year, the percentage of GDP in this country that came from manufacturing was 8%. That number within the next 7 years is supposed to go to 25%. The government freely shares that information with us. Do with that what you will. Mm-hmm. Build manufacturing, don't build manufacturing, but if you're going to build manufacturing, know that you have tailwind, you have a regulator on your side, you're going to be building something interesting in a very quickly growing part of the economy, and the economy itself is growing at 7% a year.
That's wonderful.
For me, it's don't work in silos. Everyone's under one roof. Everyone's trying to achieve the same thing. So do leverage the ecosystems out there. We all talk with each other, all the different hubs, all the different VCs. We're all working towards the same objective. So if you're a founder, don't work in silos. Ask someone who made 100 mistakes before you, learn from them. Go to the regulator, go to the VCs, go to anyone you can work with and leverage that ecosystem that's here, because I don't think that exists anywhere else in the world.
That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for the time. I think it was really enlightening. And, if you want to have further conversations, we're going to take them off the stage because we have to set up for the next one. But I really do appreciate the time that you spent with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thanks, Peter.